Hello, and welcome to Autology, the podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This episode is called Self Driving Self Assessment Drivers Have Their Say. And you're here with me, Alicia Thakalal, and Brock Walquist, Senior Analyst for Autonomy, alongside Yanina Mills, Senior Analyst for Consumer Insights. Hello to you both, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having us, Alicia.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
No worries at all. Glad you could be here. So, today's podcast is all about consumer sentiment around ADAS and autonomy. But the first question I really have is what are some of the highlights that you can share from this year's consumer survey, or even perhaps what stood out to you the most in the survey results?
Yeah, I think largely the same as 2022 results, but we did see a few changes here and there. The 2023 survey showed that, almost all respondents understand and have interest in advanced driving features. We did see that for the third year in a row. Blind spot detection was chosen to be the most desirable feature, and a lot of the top five features kind of remained the same. However, we did see something like forward collision warning has now entered the top five, jumping to third place from with 80% desirability. Consumers, they likely find these features most desirable not just because of their functionality, obviously, which are to provide those warning signals or perform emergency actions in their daily driving experience, but also because these features are becoming more available in vehicles, which results in greater exposure more regularly. And when asking consumers about something like their willingness to pay, so feature desirability does not always translate to willingness to pay for those same advanced driving features. And we see an inverse preference here. And this has been fairly consistent with each time that we've ran this survey. They're typically willing to pay more for the least desirable features, and these being the ones that enable some kind of like low level autonomous driving, which would thereby require more complexity. More than 50% of respondents expected to get warning and emergency safety activation features to be included in the vehicle price. And this could be the result of current market penetration, as many of these features are actually already available in many of the newer vehicles. And so consumers may expect that the features be built into the base price of the vehicle. Um, we did see that the previous survey, the 2022 survey, and this survey found an increase in overall desirability for a lot of these features, minimum of 60% desirability, which is up from about maybe 50% last or 50% in 2020. We did see, interestingly enough, automated driving features associated with city driving were among the least desired, which is a change from the previous years. And this may be attributed to that perceived higher level of complexity that this type of driving requires, and maybe a distrust of the system's ability to perform safely and effectively. Another thing is self-driving car, or autonomous vehicles, categorized in that level 4 and level 5 space, consistently has been found to be the least desirable. And obviously, this year is really no different. And this is both unsurprising and understandable for the most part. Many consumers don't have enough or even any exposure to these higher levels of automation, and they likely remain skeptical of the technology or even how it relates to their own driving experiences. So, therefore, the more removed a consumer is from the driving experience or control of the vehicle via the feature or application, the less desirable it might be. Let's see what else. Automated parking features typically score the lowest for willingness to pay, and we often find a clear gap between the average prices that these consumers are willing to pay and what these option prices are actually running in the market. Oh, in fact, safety ratings. Obviously, consumers want safe vehicles, right? And so safety ratings do play an important role in many of the consumers' vehicle purchasing decisions. This survey found very much the same behavior as the previous year. I believe it was like 92% maybe of respondents that indicated safety ratings were either somewhat or very important. A lot of them are actually willing to pay extra for those vehicles with higher safety ratings. On the other hand, it was interesting to see that respondents from Germany and Japan do continue to show the lowest interest or willingness to pay for high vehicle safety ratings compared with other countries. And this could be kind of that global reputation around German and Japanese automakers, kind of their ability to build those reliable and quality vehicles. Another thing is that respondents are actually, for this year, were more open to conditional autonomy since the 2022 iteration of the survey. And this conditional autonomy is kind of like, are they willing to give up some of that vehicle control um, to, whether it's city driving, maybe highway driving, rural driving, whatever it may be. That's what we consider conditional autonomy. And for this year, we found that 53% were claiming efficiency as the primary use case for something like automated driving mode. And I think pretty consistently, we have found that consumers are finding some of those more established automotive brands, typically like the German premium brands and Japanese automakers, are more trusted in developing something like self-driving technology. And so those are kind of the highlights from this year.
Yeah, and I think in addition to what Jan had to say, obviously she's our consumer expert, and she can talk about these surveys in a significant amount of detail as she just did there. But often, being an analyst within this, technology domain, we're constantly looking at new vehicles and the technology associated with them. So when we look at the familiarity aspect of this survey, I think one thing that, continues to be a reminder is that many of the many of the consumers surveyed here still, barely, above 50% for some of these features. Is there any sort of familiarity? Park Assist being the highest with a 58% familiarity, but many other common technologies still falling below 50% and 40% at times. So, when we have these conversations that the average vehicle on the road is, often more than 10 years old, this is a good reminder that new vehicles may be equipped with some of this technology. However, some of the older vehicles still not, and the new vehicle owner or the older vehicle owners, I should say, still not familiar with these. So as consumers are getting in these newer vehicles that are well equipped with driver assistance technology and sometimes automated driving technology, I think we'll continue to see some of the trends within the survey around, interest, willingness to pay, definitely evolve, but always interesting and a good reminder that yeah, with some of these older vehicles, a lot of these features aren't around. So this is really a work in progress, getting consumers familiar with even the most basic driver assistance features.
Okay, understood. And on the point of willingness to pay, Yana, you mentioned earlier that consumers are more willing to pay for at least desirable features. I mean, should OEMs be concerned by that trend?
I wouldn't say so, not particularly. If anything, it's kind of expected, especially considering the lack of exposure that the mainstream market has to these technologies. As Brock mentioned, some of the older vehicles on the road, clearly that consumers don't have access to this, so it's not a surprise. It's not really a concern. It's just the standard sort of adoption cycle at this point. We see, basic ADAS features have greater exposure and gradually becoming more standardized, and especially with a lot of these regulations that are coming out for, I believe it's features like automatic emergency braking, and obviously Brock can speak to this a little bit better than I can. But with further exposure and standardization with some of these technologies, this will start to change a bit. We do see automated driving features are less prominent, so typically limited to some of the premium or the luxury trim vehicles. So it's expected. We do see that this is going to continue until there's wider adoption of these technologies in the mainstream market.
Yeah, and I think just a real quick addition from my perspective, even though maybe interest in a self-driving vehicle maybe a bit lower, the interest to get in that vehicle, to pay for a service that doesn't include a safety driver or a driver at all. Although there might be hesitancy around that and trust of a technology, I think it's also a reminder that the market often recognizes the value of such such technologies, of such capabilities. Therefore, there is a bit of a disconnect, but I would agree, no real reason for concern at this point.
Okay, understood. I mean, but there still seems to be a bit of disconnect, I think, when it comes to safety. I mean, you mentioned buyers want safer cars and they're willing to pay for safety ratings or higher safety ratings, rather. Yet they seem unwilling to pay for those sort of basic ADAS features that presumably enable those higher ratings in the first place. I mean, is it that consumers believe safety ratings are only based on crash worthiness rather than the sort of ADAS features, etc.?
Yeah, and I think this one's a loaded question, and I'll kind of have two parts of my answer here. One, in the United States market where I'm located, safety ratings are based on crash worthiness, at least from NHTSA and the 5 stars safety rating program, where there's recommendations around automatic emergency braking, lane keep assist, etc. However, none of that is built into the scoring. With an evaluation agency like IIHS, there is consideration for some of the crash reduction and crash avoidance due to safety features, but in large, these sort of technologies are not considered in such safety ratings. That's not consistent globally. Euro NCAP, for example, is one of the most progressive safety agencies around the world, and we often see Japan and China following closely behind them. So maybe this is just more of a U.S. market issue. However, there is a lot of nuance when it comes to such safety ratings, and at the end of the day, when we look at some of the survey results here, 81% of buyers are willing to pay more for vehicles with higher safety ratings, and 92 are stating that safety ratings are somewhat or very important when buying a vehicle. So a pretty firm statement from the consumer side on, yes, there's also the crash worthiness side, and there's an obvious demand for safety. So maybe handing it back to some of these agencies and different regulators around the world to really start getting driver assistance systems involved in this. And then there's another part of that question as well, when it comes to the willingness to pay for basic ADAS features. And from the survey, more than 50% of buyers expect these features to be standard. And I think that's more responsive to the market than anything. We see around the world large automakers standardizing basic ADAS features, and even some going as far as standardizing automated driving features. Where you look at level 2 technologies that combine adaptive cruise control and lane centering for some, conditional automation. When you see these sorts of trends of these being built into vehicle price, I think, this consumer trend or this, consistent response of, being less willing to pay for basic ADAS features has more so to do with a market and an ecosystem that is really pushing out, these ADAS features as standard. And therefore, there is no reason to pay for the most part.
Understood. And just building on that, Brock, do you think that maybe, these evaluation agencies like IIHS and Euro NCAP, do you think they should do more to sort of promote the role of ADAS in vehicle safety or maybe clarify their role when it comes to ratings?
Yeah, and I think this one comes at a good time. Within the last couple of months, we've had NHTSA continuing to move forward with a mandate on automatic emergency braking systems in the United States, which is a big step. That would start putting rear parking cameras and also that forward AEB as standard features on every vehicle sold in the country. So we're definitely seeing progress there, and Euro NCAP has a quite, again, progressive timeline when it comes to a number of different features, including driver facial monitoring, and thinking a little bit further out too about the adoption of automated driving features. So we are seeing a good amount of progress when it comes to promoting the role of ADAS in vehicle safety, and more so than just promoting or recommending, making this standard for automakers to include in their vehicle. So I think we're getting there. To date, some of these safety ratings again are largely based on crash worthiness, but I think once we see a balance, like an agency that like IIHS does, where it's considering both the crash worthiness, which of course is very important, but also is considering driver assistance technologies. I think that's really where we find the sweet spot in the future of ratings.
Okay, understood. So it appears in general that buyers have been unsure about the move from level two to higher levels of autonomy. I mean, for a manufacturer, it's certainly a big leap in shifting responsibility from the driver to the OEM, both in terms of technical capabilities and also in terms of liability. Do you think that car makers are maybe wasting their efforts in building ADAS technology, given that consumers don't appear willing to reward them for it?
Yeah, I think this is a good one. And Yana touched on it in good detail earlier, talking about as we remove the driver from the loop of the driving activity, there being a little bit of hesitancy to lean on the system. That being said, uh, there's no doubt that there is a demand for convenience technologies. Adaptive cruise control, for example, in the level one spectrum has always been very sought after. When consumers are considering a new vehicle. And as we move into the level two and level two plus space, level two plus being where the driver is able to remove their hands from the steering wheel, often due to a driver monitoring camera. I think there's definitely going to be value there that consumers are just going to need to gain familiarity with. When we take a step back and we look at this market in general, I can speak of an example like Cadillac. Cadillac brought Super Cruise to the CT6 back in the 2017-2018 timeline, and for about 3 years, that was the only vehicle on the road, from General Motors that had this system. Now they've slowly, or maybe not quite slowly, but they've started to push this out a little bit further. Probably as cost has come down from the supply chain of all the sensing required for these sorts of systems, but also I'm sure trust as well, that this system is capable of performing on more than just a CT6. I believe by the end of this year they're targeting 23 different nameplates to have Super Cruise. So, Super Cruise was the first of its kind in this level two plus space, eyes on, hands off driving. And we've seen many follow recently. For example, we have Mercedes in Germany and now the United States launching their level three system on the S class and EQS. But again, when you consider these sort of vehicles, how many people are buying S classes and EQSs? So as long story short, as these systems sort of move downstream, I think the desirability will start to pick up. I talked a little bit about familiarity earlier, and I think this is going to be another one where there has to be a familiarity aspect in order to ultimately trust these systems. So as it becomes more available from an OEM perspective, and from a market perspective, I don't think that there should be any early concerns about consumers not being willing to adopt a convenience technology and ultimately reward OEMs for their R&D efforts to get these out into the market.
Yeah, I agree. Um, I don't think it's necessarily a wasted effort by any stretch of the imagination. And you touched on a really big part of this, Brock, is the trust aspect. And I don't think consumers are necessarily going to trust all of this, these higher levels of automation just as is. They need that gradual introduction, and these ADAS efforts are essentially the building blocks for that. And so the greater exposure, the greater familiarity that these consumers have with some of these more basic ADAS features and these ADAS technologies as they progress to those higher levels of automation, the more successful I think the higher levels will be in the market.
Okay, understood. And just before we wrap up today's episode, I kind of have a question in two parts. I mean, Brock, when do you think that L4 technology will be widespread, sort of worldwide? And then, Yana, for the second part, what would it then take for consumers to be sold on self-driving vehicles?
That might be $1 million question, Alicia. We get it often, and we're at the point where we're seeing, especially in major markets and in major cities, a lot of testing going on, some deployment as well. We think about a leader in this space, Waymo. they're now entering 3 or 4 cities. Um, with with their autonomous driving capability. But again, a lot of this is very geographically limited to certain areas of cities. Only certain numbers of people being able to use these services. So there's a lot to break down here. But I think long story short, uh, through through the coming years, we'll continue to see further deployments across major regions that are kind of fit to adopt this sort of self-driving technology, mobility as a service, as a lot of the industry will say, but still a lot of geographic and technology limitations here to overcome. So will there be individual testing and services across the world as far as specific cities? I'm sure you'll see it. You will see it in cities like Dubai, a number of major cities in China. Phoenix, Arizona is a hot name in the United States, along with San Francisco. So you'll continue to see these specific deployments. However, for widespread deployments across many cities, including smaller ones, I wouldn't necessarily hold my breath. There's still quite a bit of work to be done in that front.
Yeah, and I mean, as from the consumer perspective, um, another interesting thing that you touched on, Brock, is that mobility as a service. I think that's kind of where we have to start in building some of the relatable use cases. Things like robo taxis. Once consumers start to see this implementation in the real world, I think that will gradually help consumers to understand the technology, the use cases, and getting a little bit more acclimated to the technologies that are behind it. And granted, of course, not everyone is going to have access to things like that, to robo taxis and mobility as a service. But like I mentioned, I think that gradual introduction of a lot of these ADAS features that build onto the higher levels of automation to kind of gain further exposure to these technologies is what's going to end up selling self-driving vehicles to the mainstream market.
Understood. I notice also that there's a definite swerve there with an exact date. Would you say it would be, I mean, you see driverless cars on the road by, say, 2035, or is it more out to 2040?
Yeah, I mean, there's driverless cars on the road today. So, putting a timeline on that, we see it across major cities and major mobility players across the world. Again, when we start thinking about expanding this geography and moving, beyond just major cities and very technology rich markets, I think that's a tough one. A tough one to answer. I think by 2030, the market will surely be larger than it is today. But understanding when this sort of technology could start hitting smaller cities, that's one I'm not sure I have an answer for.
Understood it. I think it was worth a try for asking.
Of course.
Wonderful. Okay, well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. A big thank you to you both for joining Autology.
Yes, of
Yep.
course. Thank you again for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And thank you to all you listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our Autology at spglobal.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcast. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.